Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL playoffs, round number 1 overview and analysis video in the summer split. We are done with the regular season. We have wrapped up our best of 1 stage. It's finally time to get to some best of 3s here in the NACL as we have our 8 teams remaining. 2 have been eliminated. Unfortunate for Vancouver Impact and for CCG that they will not be a part of our playoffs, but we still have a lot of fun action to go over for round 1 series, 4 best of 3s to cover today. By the end of today, not only are we going to know our teams that are guaranteeing top 6 and, getting into winners round 2, but we're also going to know our teams that are fighting it out to not be the first 2 eliminated down in lower bracket for next week. So very excited to go over it. If you're excited, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from these series, and did you expect the outcomes? I know there were a lot of upsets this week, and I'll certainly be talking about them on the channel, but let me know if you thought that these upsets were possible or if you were surprised by the outcomes here. Very curious to know where you land on all of that stuff. But without further ado, let's jump into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, normally I would be updating my power rankings and doing all that stuff, but as we are in playoffs, we'll take a look at the bracket, kind of preview everything that's happening both in winners round 2 and lower bracket round 1, and talk about which teams I think are positioned well and which teams I'm maybe a bit concerned about after this first round of action. But most of that will be spent, at the end of the video. Most of the video, of course, will be going over the games themselves, and that means starting with our first series of round number 1. And the upsets come quick and fast because in our number 1 versus number 8 seed matchup, the largest disparity you can get here in the playoffs, we are already seeing a massive turn of fate as we saw the number 1 seeded Supernova take on the number 8 seeded Blue Otter. And Blue Otter is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They're going to move on to round 2, and they're going to call into question just how valid these best of 1s actually are. Blue Otter has been getting better over the course of this split. They pick up a massive win on the final day to get themselves into playoffs on a tiebreaker, essentially, and, they've looked very questionable. This is a team that really benefited a lot from a conviction forfeit in the regular season, and I think a lot of people are kind of looking at them as a team that maybe wouldn't have made playoffs without that forfeit coming in, without a lot of those technical problems coming in, and them being fortunate in that case. But regardless of whether or not you think they, played their way in here in the regular season, they certainly deserve to be here in terms of the talent that's on this team, and they more than proved that in this series, and they're making the most of their opportunity, picking up a win over the number 1 team in the regular season. They only dropped 2 best of 1s, and one of those was on the final day when things had already been completely stabilized, and it's clear they weren't trying all that hard. They went up against a very weird conviction comp, and they just ended up losing to it. The only actual loss I think they suffered was to Citadel in the regular season. They were able to take down everyone else, including this Blue Otter team, and yet here they are when it matters the most in a best of 3, and they just can't step up. They were worse today. Quite frankly, you could argue that they were weaker in all 3 games. They just happened to pull out game number 2 in a nail-biter, an almost 40-minute type of game. Their 2 losses, they were nowhere close to where Blue Otter was at, and I think they got outdrafted. I think they got outplayed in this series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, as you could probably tell from the thumbnail of this video, is going to go to Kryra in the jungle. I've been a huge Kryra fan ever since, I would say like a year and a half ago. Really, it was the time he subbed in for CCG that kind of opened my eyes to his tier 3 tape. But ever since then, like watching him in tier 3, it's clear that this guy is like an actual difference maker at the tier 2 level. I was surprised when obviously he wasn't given like the green light to go play for a team like DarkZero, that they went for someone like Kisno instead. I love Kisno, but I think Kryra is really a player that you can build around and try to, turn into a tier 1 quality player. Blue Otter capitalizing on the misfortunes of Pulse and DarkZero throughout this season by being able to pick him up as their starting jungler. And I've said it once, I'll say it again, like they've had a couple of junglers on the team throughout this year. Music obviously starting off the year as their starting jungler. Keel was looking like he was going to start in the jungle. They had to emergency pick up someone like Lojaz. Kryra is the best jungler they've had all year long, and I think he very much proved it in this series. He pulls out his signature Zac in game number 3 and takes over on the R5. This champion is very difficult to deal with if you don't have a dedicated threat to keeping Zac out of your backline. Like, if you don't have someone that can really spy and keep Zac away from your main carries, that can consistently peel throughout the entirety of a fight, there's almost no way for Zac to lose a lot of these exchanges. It was really smart of Blue Otter to see the angle for Zac, because you have to deal with the Olaf and you have to deal with the Alistar early on. and that means that there's nobody that can sit there and spy the Zac and actually keep him away from Jhin and from Aurora and from a lot of the champions that really need to output a ton of damage in these fights in order to be relevant, and Kryra completely took over. Now, I don't think he was perfect the rest of the series, but the Wukong game was great. I thought the Xin Zhao was pretty good. Like, were there mistakes? Sure, he's a young player that I think can clean up some of the mid-game stuff, but for the most part, he was the best player on the Rift today in a game that mattered a lot for Blue Otter's chances, and that cannot be undersold. Kryra is genuinely a star in the making as far as I'm concerned, and I think he's really elevated the rest of Blue Otter. But let's not take credit away from Blue Otter here. A couple of really fun rivalries kind of going on the Rift here. I think most notably Array versus Breezy, bot lane duo from the spring split playing together for CCG, going against each other, and Array very much coming out on top. He had a great game number 3 on the Senna, looked really good on the Corki, even on the Ezreal. I think he was generally fine. Array is just so stable as a starting AD carry in the NACL. It's really hard to find weaknesses or holes in Array's game, and I think he really showcases that on the biggest stage, as he's always going to perform at a pretty consistent level. Scary Jerry was not as good as Array was today, and part of that was Rovex with the setup that he was able to create. Part of that was the rest of the map just winning. Quacker was dominating Hoarder on the top side. The 1v1 was very much in his favor basically throughout the entirety of the series. He picks up at least one solo kill off the top of my brain. I didn't exactly write down how many solo kills he got, but I can definitely remember one, and you know, Quacker really was always ahead in terms of the 1v1 with resources, and then because Supernova had to invest so much into trying to keep Hoarder in this series and in these games, like especially game number 3, it gave a lot of attention for Kryra to start moving around the map and start to play for players like Samikin, who got his Mel in game number 3. Everything just kind of bleeding into each other. Blue Otter capitalizing off of their fantastic start, off of their ability to outplay and outhands what Supernova was doing on the other side, and they more than earned this victory. They were the better team here today. It's not like a typical 1 versus 8 seed matchup where even if the 8 seed wins, it's contentious and, you know, the number 1 team made a lot of mistakes. This did not feel like a number 8 team in terms of power rankings. This team played clinical, they played strong, they had great drafts, they had really good map awareness, and it's clear that Fearless is going to benefit Blue Otter more than it might benefit a lot of the other teams, and that's just massive. They move on to round 2, they keep their extra life. Big stuff for Blue Otter. And for Supernova on the other side, this is just about as disastrous of a result as you could ever possibly get in round number 1, losing to the number 8 team that I think a lot of people did not even see as a playoff team, saw as kind of a consolation playoff team. Clearly that was wrong. Like, I want to make that clear, by the way. This isn't negative on Supernova. It's a positive on Blue Otter, but it's also a negative on Supernova. It can be both of those things. You can't really afford to lose this series, and you know what? You weren't better here today. You got completely outplayed in a couple of key areas. I think that there are multiple players that you can point to and say that they were problems on the team today. I don't think Dardoch played well. Kryra was absolutely the better jungler. He had much more control in the mid game, and he did a better job of playing off of his laners, but his laners were winning. I think Scary Jerry and Breezy had one of their weakest series of the entire year, and specifically Hoarder on the top side was just kind of bad throughout these games. He's gonna get done of the series for me. I love Hoarder. Trust me, I'm like number 1 on the Hoarder fan club. This was not it today. Quacker was infinitely better than Hoarder was on the top side, in and out of lane, especially in lane though. Hoarder was getting demolished in the 1v1. It was actually really frustrating to watch because it completely took away any sort of momentum that Supernova had, especially in game 3 on the Gnar. All you have to do is survive, then you can get into the late game and you can be a huge disruptor. There's not a lot of peel on the side of Blue Otter if they're going to play super aggro. You need the Olaf to go in, you need the Alistair to dive, and Zac is likely going to be following them. You don't have a lot of ways to stop a full Gnar engage if you have to play from behind if you're Blue Otter, but Gnar getting so far behind in game 3 just made it completely unwinnable. I think Hoarder actively, you know, hurt his team's chances to win this series, and it just kind of is what it is. He's a young player in a big moment, but it's certainly wasn't a step-up type of performance. Already talked a bit about it, but Dardoch, not good enough, especially outside of his signature Mundo pick in game number 2, or at least what's kind of been signature to him over the course of the year up until this point. But the Nocturne, the Trundle, especially the Nocturne, just not working out for him. Like I said, Scary Jerry and Breezy were not the better of these two bot laners. So Blaze Olive might have a good KDA, but it's not like he was taking over games. He did play a very good game in game 2 on the Rise. I do want to give him a lot of credit for that one, but Samikin was certainly more relevant on the Mel in game 3 when it mattered the most. It was a tough one for Supernova, but at the end of the day, they got outplayed in basically every single role as the number 1 seed going into the number 8 seed, and now you burn your extra life. Are they still favorites going down into the lower part of the bracket? Probably, basically regardless of who they face. And trust me, you know, now they have to face a 4 or 5 seed. That's a terrible draw for either Conviction or Citadel, which we will talk about in the upcoming series. But this is a team that clearly has weaknesses. They are clearly not the end-all be-all number 1 team in the league, favorites to win the entire tournament like I think a lot of people expected them to be. I think you can reasonably move them down quite a bit after this performance, because it wasn't just a fluky loss. They genuinely were just worse here today, and Blue Otter was genuinely just better. This team is actually terrifying right now in the form that they are in. Kryra has clearly elevated this team, and everybody else is starting to get on the same page as well. This team is no stranger to miracle runs at the end of a massive split, and we could very much be primed for another one as we head even further into the playoffs. But then moving on to our second series of round number 1, and this was the closest matchup in terms of seeding, even if we got the furthest in our first one. It was Conviction taking on Citadel Gaming, and Conviction is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. And they're going to do it in pretty great fashion. Game 1 was back and forth. There was a lot of good action going on both sides, but unfortunately Citadel couldn't keep finding the angles to get in, and eventually this quirky Ezreal double marksman comp ended up really coming to fruition for Conviction. And in Game 2, they just kind of had their number from the start of the game. They really ended up outplaying them, and the Kaisa ended up taking over for that quadra kill in the back half. Really, really great stuff from Conviction, and really, I think the narrative takeaway from this series is not that Citadel is bad, but rather that they are exactly what they have been for the entirety of the year up until this point, which are kind of the gatekeepers here in the NACL. They are probably a bit worse than the upper tier teams, whatever you want to put as an upper tier team at this point, especially after Supernova's loss, but they're probably not quite on the same level as like the teams below them in the standings either. I think that they definitely are better than a lot of them. Unfortunately, with this loss, we might never know if they have that opportunity with how the bracket has ended up shaping out, but at the end of the day, it is a big, big win for Conviction, and I think if you want to play narrative ball with them, the only question we had about Conviction is how is this team going to adapt to best of 3s and best of 5s once we get into Fearless? If that was the question, well, we might not have a clear-cut answer because it only went to 2 games, but it looks pretty damn good so far in the 2 games that we have seen. We can go ahead and talk about it. Viper is going to be the player that once again gets player of the series for me. I know I've given him quite a few of these player of the series over the course of this split, but that's because I think he deserves it in terms of how he's playing. I really do think he's been the best player on Conviction, certainly kind of the main character of how they like to play the game. Perry as a facilitator has been great. TF Blade has really thrived playing tanks, and then the occasional Jax when he's allowed to on the top side of the map. And Evolved has really been like the prototypical shove and row mid laner. He's been the best in that role throughout the entirety of the NACL in terms of how things are going. He's been awesome as a secondary carry for this team. Stunt obviously has been great as well, but Viper has really been the resource guy. He's been the one that everybody pumps resources into and hopes to kind of, you know, get the most out of in the late game. And quite frankly, he's done a great job of being able to capitalize on that. He's super aggressive as a player. His mechanics are obviously top notch. Genuinely, he could be one of the top like 3-ish mechanical players in the NACL right now in terms of just how things are going. If he had more experience playing the AD carry role, I actually just think he might be the best ADC in the entirety of tier 2, which is a crazy thing to say, but it kind of is the case. He really was that valuable to Conviction, and he continues to be a really big driving piece. Again, the quadra kill at the end of game number 2 really sealed the fate of Citadel, but he was great throughout the majority of the series up until that point. In that same vein, he is starting to kind of get comfortable, I think, playing a little bit slower in the early game, hence Corki and Kaisa, but still a very aggressive player. He wants to go toe-to-toe with the enemy ADC, wants to play aggressive in the 2v2. Stunt helps a lot with that, and Stunt's really been fantastic across this split as well, but it's this bot lane duo. Like, you have to highlight them as kind of the main point right now for Conviction, because I think the entire team is set up to highlight them as kind of the main point for Conviction. So credit to them. Viper and Stunt have really come along as a great duo here, and then how can you not shout out the rest of the team? TF Blade and Evolved as the solo laners were excellent here. Evolved is really, like, phenomenal. Like, it's really, really crazy just how good this guy is at playing a competitive style. You wouldn't expect somebody who hasn't played competitive in a while to be as good in this kind of role as he is, but I've talked about it all split long. He's like one of the better macro mid laners in the entire league, just in terms of how he plays the map, how he opens things up for Conviction, and how they're able to play around everyone else because of his generic leads that he's able to get. He's able to push his lanes and get individual 1v1 leads, and then he's able to utilize that to make Perry's life easier and to make Stunt's life easier, and that in turn obviously makes Conviction's life a lot easier. It's something that really good and experienced mid laners sometimes struggle with, and Evolved has been good at it basically from day one here on Conviction. Really impressive stuff there. TF Blade has been great, especially in the back half of the split, I would say. On the top side, he's been playing tanks a lot more, but when he doesn't get tanks, he does sometimes get his signature picks like the Jax on the top side and the Gragas, and it makes him look incredibly comfortable there. Perry, the one player that, you know, I didn't really shout out, has been super consistent as an engaged threat for this team on things like Jarvan, on Wukong, like a lot of those more aggressive types of engage picks. He wants to go deep and he wants to create opportunities. But I think the fun thing is that Perry is really taking a backseat role in the sense of, he doesn't need to be the main character on this team. He's happy to facilitate the rest of the team doing as much damage as possible and just being the setup guy. A lot of egos have been put aside for this Conviction roster, and quite frankly, it's made them one of the most dangerous teams in the league. With Supernova in particular losing on the top side, it is very realistic for this team to not only qualify for the promotion tournament, but actually be a threat to promote into the LTA, which is a crazy thing to say. But for Citadel on the other side, this team just didn't really have the firepower, to be quite frank. I think they had some good moments in game number 1, especially where things were quite close, and if they had a bit more damage in terms of what their draft was, maybe things end up working out. I love Talia Varus. I think that combo is really difficult to deal with, but when you do get into the late game with double marksman plus Karma, as long as the front line does their job on Conviction, it's really hard to play front to back in that exchange, and Kenvi just kept diving in only to die almost instantly in terms of a lot of these engages. Game 2 kind of fell apart basically from the start. You can't really look at any good performances in that second game, but it is what it is, right? Like, Citadel came into this as underdogs. Even if I personally predicted them to win this, that had more to do with the fact that I just didn't know what Conviction was going to be. Well, here you go. Conviction is exactly who we thought they were going to be. Therefore, Citadel is going to struggle in this series, and unfortunately for them, that's what happened. Kenvi is going to get dud of the series, not really because of the Vi. The Vi was okay. I think the KDA was much worse than maybe the gameplay would indicate, but the Pantheon game in game 2 just never really ended up working out. You go for that double macro duo in the mid jungle with Pantheon Rise, and if you're not able to, actually push forward and generate resources for the team, things can get out of control really quickly. For Citadel, he was active, but a lot of times he was way too active in terms of how things ended up going, and I think Perry generally had more of an impact on the game as a whole. Kenvi really struggled in this one of his weaker series, in my opinion, of the entire split up until this point. I think you could say similar things about Philip on the top side. TF Blade was certainly better than Philip, which I think was surprising to me. I really like Philip as a player, and I think he's been good this year, but wasn't the best series of all time for him. I think Bradley, Instinct, Diamond even, they were all fine, generically speaking. I think game 2, everybody kind of had their problems. The Yunara never really was able to get online, but at the end of the day, Citadel just kind of felt out-tempoed, and at the end of game number 1, it just didn't really feel like they had, like I said, the firepower to be able to push past what Conviction had built for themselves, and that just kind of feels like the spot that Citadel is stuck in, and now they're in a terrible position. They have to go up against Supernova in the lower bracket with no more extra life. That is worst case scenario for Citadel, but for Conviction, they are one series away from qualifying for the promotion tournament, from getting into winners finals and into the best of 5s, and they get to play Blue Otter, a team that they never got the chance to face in the regular season. It's going to be a fun one, and I'm really excited to see if this team can keep their hot form up. But that's going to bring us to day number 2, our second day of round 1 action. And kicking off day number 2 here was a matchup between the number 3 seeded DarkZero and the number 6 seeded Dorado Gaming, where Dorado are going to pick up not just a series victory, but a 2-0 series victory here. And honestly, this is going to be quite a quick discussion in terms of how things go. Not because I think DarkZero got smoked or anything like that. I don't think they played terrible. I think that there were some moments in this series where they looked okay in terms of the way that they were presenting themselves, but Dorado had the best player on the Rift, and it was not particularly close. I think we have to start having a discussion that Sushi is just ready for the big time. Maybe not tier 1, right? But this guy, he had his problems in the regular season and best of 1s. You get him into the playoffs, he's going to play his best League of Legends. He did it last split for Near Airport when he was subbing in, and he's clearly ready to do it again here for Dorado. This might just be the clutch performer of tier 2. He's certainly building a pretty good resume in that regard, and if that's going to be something that continues to linger for Dorado, watch out for this team, because this is genuinely one of the most dominant playoff performances that I have seen in the NACL in quite a long time. That KDA, that scoreline is indicative of just how well he played. 28, 0, and 17 across 2 games of action. 14 kills in both games, 0 deaths in both games. Absolutely unbelievable. And he did it on 2 different kinds of champions. The Jhin in game number 1, when Mixture was doing a great job of setting things up on this Bard that looked fantastic. And then game 2, when it was this Fiesta where the Akali on the top side, Ariana, the former mid laner, pulling out the Akali in game 2, pops off and gets a bunch of kills 5 minutes into the game, and then Sushi can have this really easy phase where he can just take over in every single fight that they end up playing out. You have so much engage coming in from things like Maokai and Wukong in both individual games, even from Yone and Orianna. Obviously, we already talked about the Bard. The setup was absolutely there for Dorado to take over, but it had to be up to Sushi to follow through, and this was a dominant kind of performance. Again, if he's going to play like this, by the way, he's player of the series. I don't know if that's, shocking to anybody who's watching this. I don't imagine anybody is confused. by why I'm giving Sushi player of the series. But if he's going to play like this in the playoffs, they can beat anybody. Like, they can win the entire league. That's genuinely the kind of performance that Sushi put on here today. And this is the reason that people were so excited about this guy coming into this split. Why Dorado looked at this as an upgrade over Fadachan coming in as the AD carry for them as they enter tier 2. And that's because his mechanical ceiling is so much higher than basically anybody else. Citadel is a very good player on the other side of this matchup. In fact, he's been very good over the course of this year. I would argue he's arguably been the most consistent AD carry in terms of just raw production this split. Now, Jerry is up there as well. I think Viper is up there in terms of the pop-off performances, obviously tactical, even though he had a couple of games, I would say, over the course of this split that weren't perfect. But Citadel is not a slouch. This is a guy who's been consistently successful at the tier 2 level and is looked at as a potential tier 1 prospect. Sushi completely outplayed him. And Citadel played fine in this series. He didn't really make any major mistakes, but Sushi was just so much more active and proactive in terms of how the game was going that you can't say anything other than that he was the better AD carry across this series. It's so impressive. And again, if he can keep this up, this team is actually going to completely overhaul any sort of expectations they had for themselves. Wasn't just him though. Ariana definitely deserves some shouts for the Akali in game 2. Some of it was bad. Most of it was incredibly good from him. And obviously he's a former mid laner. You can see it in the way that he plays this champion. You know, the call out of like, this was my former main. Why would you give this to me in game number 2? Pretty funny in the interview there overall. But Ariana looking great. I think he's looked great throughout a majority of this split. Kay has been a very solid and strong top laner on the other side, and Ariana outplayed him. Kaido was great in this series. He can be pretty inconsistent, but put him on Maokai and Wukong, let him be set up for the rest of this team, and boy, does that work out. Shochi, as per usual, just kind of makes everybody else on the team look like $1,000,000, especially on things like Orianna in game 2. He's always been really good at this champ, at least from a competitive standpoint. I know he doesn't always favor control mages, but oftentimes it ends up looking very good for him, and we already called it out, but Mixture's Bard in game number 1 might have been arguably the single best game anyone played in this series. What a flashy Bard game to really be able to set up that Jhin, but he was still good on Leona in game 2. Dorado just looked so awesome throughout this entire series, and you just have to be excited for this team. They also came in as pretty big underdogs, and yet here they are taking down one of the big 3, a team that was in, you know, the finals last split. They end up taking them down and moving on to winners round 2. And DarkZero, not a good showing, I would say, from them. I think that there were good moments. Again, I think Sajed was honestly fine in this series. Kisno, I think, had a couple of nice moments on the Ivern and on the Xin Zhao. I don't think Zyko was a problem the entire time, but really at the end of the day, even the players that I'm kind of hyping up here, like Sajed and Kisno that I think played okay, it's not like they weren't outplayed by their opposition. Sushi and Kaido were better than Kisno and Sajed. I don't think that's arguable in any conceivable way. But, like, even then, like, you had other performances that weren't perfect in that same vein. Toasty is going to get done of the series for me. He was way too aggressive in terms of his positioning on the Azir, on the Syndra, and it really got punished, I would say, throughout the back end here. Especially the Syndra. As that champion, you really need to make sure that your positioning is on point, because if you get caught out, there's really no way for you to be able to keep yourself safe. That's kind of the case for a lot of control/burst mages that kind of exist in this, you know, whole area. But Toasty just didn't play well enough. Leading your team in deaths when you're playing Azir and Syndra is not good enough, and I think you could see it in terms of the actual production. I love Toasty as a player. I think he is somebody that I expected to see in tier 1 this year, but you know, in the playoff series, got to be able to step up, and this was not it. Kay has been such an integral part towards why this team has found success so far this split. Despite all of the changes going into summer, he wasn't better than Ariana. In fact, he was worse than Ariana in this series. You know, Zyko as a playmaker, I never think really got in that zone to be able to get out of the map and move around. So DarkZero just kind of feeling like they're outplayed in this series. It was very similar to what we talked about with Supernova. They didn't take a single game in this series. It's not just them losing, it's them losing convincingly by a large margin in terms of how these games broke down, and that's frustrating, I think, for DarkZero. They have to be able to rebound, they have to keep their foot on the gas. They know what it's like to have their backs up against the wall, both DarkZero and Maryville do, but this is certainly a bit of a different playoffs with just the way things are breaking down, and you can kind of throw a lot of the expectations for it out the window with the way that these results are going, because you can see it once again with Dorado coming in here. They are just better than a lot of people, you know, thought they would be, that I thought they would be going into this. Their tape in the regular season was inconsistent, but if Sushi is going to step up and genuinely be elite in the bot lane, which we know is possible, but I'm shocked to see happen so effortlessly, if Kaido is actually going to be a strong jungler, we can trust Shochi, and Mixture honestly has been pretty consistent throughout this split. I think Ariana has been very consistent throughout this split. Dorado is now only 2 series away. They are a round 2 and a winners finals away from making the promotion tournament and genuinely being a team that fights to qualify for tier 1, and honestly, with the way they performed here today, who's to say they can't actually be a threat to do so? But that's going to bring us to our final series of round number 1 here in the playoffs, and it was the easiest one to talk about, the biggest stomp of every single one of them. It was Luminosity Gaming taking on Winthrop University, and Luminosity absolutely obliterates Winthrop in this matchup. It was not particularly close. Neither of these teams really felt like they were on the same level at any point in this series, and I hate to say it, but that's kind of what we expected. Is this the first series so far of the playoffs to actually go as anticipated? Of course, Conviction and Citadel, I think also kind of going as anticipated, but I thought Citadel would at least take a game in a series like that. Everything else has been an upset. Dorado winning against DarkZero and Blue Otter, winning against Supernova. Those are both shockers, but this is how this should have gone. Luminosity are the team to beat in the NACL. I think a lot of people were saying that even coming out of the final regular season week, regardless of the fact that they were not the #1 seed going into playoffs. And I think, if anything, after first round here, you feel even more confident in that take because everything just kind of went right for Luminosity. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Zazel in the support position. He's been on fire ever since the end of the regular season in spring. You go to the playoffs in the spring split, and he was a monster for Luminosity. One of the biggest reasons why that team had basically no problems in the playoffs, especially getting to finals. Once he was there, it was even easier. But in the summer split, he's arguably been this team's best player. In fact, I would argue that he has been this team's best player across this summer split. He really has been influential towards what they create, and I think a lot of his aggressive playmaking instincts have come back. He started to get a bit more passive after, basically everything that happened on Shopify last year. It really feels like DSG right now for this Luminosity Gaming team, where they just feel like they are a lot further ahead than every other team that they're playing against. And I mean the DSG version that was, Fake God and Zazel and that former Cloud9 roster that ended up coming together and winning the league. That's the version of Luminosity that this feels most close to. And I think that that really is a huge positive. Zazel as an Alistair or as a Rakan, whether it be an engaged tank or just a playmaker like the Rakan, he's just so good in those positions. I think he's really started to get his confidence back under him. And I think that's really the only thing that was missing from his game previously, is that he wasn't taking these big risks, that he wasn't going for the big mega plays. He was just playing careful and safe, and that was still working for a time. But I think if he is now going to really start expressing his skill at this level, it's going to be difficult to stop, and that's kind of what we've seen. So Zazel more than earning that player of the series, in my opinion. I think you could give this to either member of the jungle mid duo as well. Tomio was excellent. Going deathless in this series is truly difficult, and he was phenomenal. If he had been a bit more active and involved in a few plays, then he would have gotten player of the series. I think his individual plays were arguably the best of anybody on the team. The problem is I think Zazel just made more plays throughout the series, so I kind of gave the nod to him. Everybody on Luminosity won, and so it's kind of difficult to narrow it down. Insanity also going deathless in this series on Corki, on Aurora. He was awesome as a damage dealer and as a primary carry for this team throughout the entirety of this, but I will say, just as a bit of an aside when it comes to Insanity, I think the KDA is a little bit misleading because almost all of that came in Game 2 on the Aurora. That being said, he still was fantastic, and if you wanted to give him player of the series, like a lot of the fans did in chat because of that Game 2 on Aurora, then be my guest. He had the best KDA on this team. Fake God only had 1 death. Tactical only had 1 death, even if Tactical didn't really have to do anything in this series. There's not even a lot to talk about. Luminosity was better in every conceivable way, and they absolutely stomped Winthrop on their way to round number 2. And for Winthrop, this is obviously a pretty disappointing way to go out in round 1. You're still obviously going down to the lower bracket, and you'll have the chance to go up against DarkZero, but that's not looking particularly good right now in terms of how things have structured, because this team looked out of it in this series. This did not even look remotely capable in terms of the type of performance that they put forward, and I think there is a real worry that this is just kind of what it's going to be like, that if Winthrop can't get their signature early game leads and they can't start snowballing games, that they're just not going to be all that relevant in the playoffs. And boy, do they have a pretty tough schedule ahead of them in order to try and be relevant. Dud of the series, anybody, literally all of them. I don't know, man. They all ended up underperforming. They all got outplayed by their opposition on the other side. Do you want me to pinpoint 1 or 2 players? It's hard for me to do so because I think, everybody just was kind of worse. I think the bot lane is, probably the one lane you can look at and say, well, they weren't quite as bad as everybody else on the map, but they weren't exactly good either. But I would say Denethor, Wilson, Sword, whoever you want to give Dud of the series to is kind of up to you. I'm giving it to Sword in the mid lane because that Ahri game in Game 2 was absolutely nightmarish. She was not productive on the Orianna in Game 1 either. Sword is a big part of why this team is successful because he is pretty good in lane, and I think in a league where mid lane has been kind of hit or miss for a lot of teams throughout the entirety of the year, Sword has been a player that has at times stepped up and actually been able to establish himself. I think with mid lane getting better in the summer split, with the general vibe of that position, increasing over the course of the year, his play has kind of gone back down to being one of the weaker mid laners in the league, and I think we definitely saw that here with Insanity and Tomio really picking on him. But Wilson did not do anything in this series. He played Nocturne and Wukong, and he never really had any pressure going into Tomio. Denethor certainly couldn't couldn't get anything going on the top side. Fake God was infinitely better than him. It's really hard to identify one player or one play that ended up going wrong for Winthrop, where everything ended up turning. They lost everywhere. They were weaker everywhere, and now they're moving down to the lower part of the bracket. I really don't have a ton more analysis after that. This looked like a statement series from Luminosity, and Winthrop now have to rebound and adapt, and then they have to go into another very good team in DarkZero and take advantage of the fact that they just got upset and kind of play on their confidence crisis that they might be going through right now. Outside of that, I think Winthrop might be pretty big favorites to be one of the first teams out here in the playoffs. But for Luminosity on the other side, really nice win they ended up picking up. This was the most dominant series of round one by far, and I think they've reestablished themselves pretty clearly as the favorites to win the NACL, and honestly, right now, favorites to gain promotion into the LTA. This team kind of had that going into the year because of all of the former LTA talent, but if anything, they're better than they were on Shopify Rebellion last year, and, you know, a lot of these players, I think, have really upgraded their skill level and kind of become much more versatile in the way that they want to play the game. They've really unlocked each other's skill level, and for this org, I'm really excited. Luminosity's been successful in a lot of other games, and I think to see them come into League of Legends and have so much success at the start is really cool. We'll see if they can continue that form going into Dorado in round number 2, but right now, this team looks basically unstoppable near the top of the standings. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL round number 1 overview and analysis video here in the summer split playoffs. Up on the screen, the updated bracket after round number 1. Blue Otter, Conviction, Dorado, and Luminosity moving on to round 2. Supernova, Citadel, DarkZero, and Winthrop moving down to lower bracket round 1. We're going to go ahead and preview all of these matchups because we will be covering them. As a reminder, winners round 2 is still best of 3, but everything on lower bracket is best of 5. And once we get into winners finals, that also becomes best of 5 in terms of the qualification series. And so while not every series we're going to talk about here is a best of 5 just yet, we are getting dangerously close to those big fearless matchups coming through for every single team, and they need to be getting ready to get deeper into those game 5 and, you know, fearless drafts that I think a lot of teams need to prepare for. But previewing the matchups we're going to get, starting with the upper bracket here, Blue Otter taking on Conviction in that first matchup. It's really hard not to favor Conviction in terms of how these two teams have looked. Blue Otter with the upset of the century here, beating Supernova 2-1 in the first round. It's hard to predict that they're going to be able to keep that form up. I think part of that was Supernova underperforming, but Blue Otter is also better than I think they're getting credit for. This is probably a top 5 or top 6 team in the NACL. I just think it's pretty reasonable to expect Conviction to actually be like a top 2 or a top 3 team right now in the NACL, especially with Supernova and DarkZero underperforming. So I'm going to predict them to win, especially in a best of 3. I'm not saying it'll be 2-0, but I do think Conviction will move on. And then for Dorado versus Luminosity, another big upset with Dorado taking down DarkZero, but they have their backs up against the wall. They're going up against the tournament favorites in Luminosity, and I can't really bet against them. I can't bet against LG really losing a series right now. They are favorites to take the entire tournament, to promote into the LTA, and, you know, I'm going to continue to push them as such. So I think Luminosity and Conviction are the two teams moving on to winners finals. But then talking about the lower bracket, these are elimination series. If you lose this, you are out of the playoffs, and winning it just moves you on to lower bracket round 2, starting with Supernova versus Citadel. It is an absolute travesty that one of these two teams is going to be, you know, 7th or 8th place in terms of how things break down. You know, there's really no reason for that to happen for either of them. I don't think either of them are even close to being that level of competition, but that's what happens when Citadel, you know, gets drawn Conviction in round 1 and Supernova gets upset. Like, that's just the way the cookie crumbles, and right now it feels like Citadel is probably going to be the team that goes out. Supernova, though, looked bad in the first round. If they end up performing poorly and drop a game here, I'm not going to be surprised, but the reality is that Supernova should be able to get their bounce back here, and they should be able to move on to round number 2. And same thing for DarkZero versus Winthrop. If anything, I think this one's even more set in stone. I feel pretty confident that DarkZero is going to have a very easy time going into Winthrop. We've seen this team and this org perform well in the playoffs, as we saw last split in spring, Winthrop that is, but it's just hard to project that that's going to happen again, especially after what we saw against Luminosity. So the 4 winners I have predicted are Conviction and Luminosity on the top side, and then Supernova and DarkZero on the bottom side. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We're going to be posting about every single series that happens here in the playoffs, as we always do, but not just the NACL. We cover all 4 of the major regions as well, so LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week on the channel. We've also been casting for LPL English. Links to that will be down in the description below. You can check out the YouTube and the Twitch. Go follow or subscribe, depending on the website, and you can kind of check a lot of my thoughts live if you want to watch me cast along with the LPL. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all